Welcome to Breaking Silence, a safe and brave space where we have real conversations about race in America.
Welcome back, everyone. So you know what really grinds my gears? When people in 2020 say that, oh, I'm so happy that my daughters are colorblind, or oh, I'm so happy that I don't see color. And I don't see your color, I see you first. So today we're going to dive deeper into the issue of colorblindness, how we see it show up in our society today, where it came from, and where this whole concept of race even started, and what we think about it.
And this is one of those things regarding colorblindness that I've learned I was doing it wrong. I was doing it all wrong, and I thought I was doing it right. So when this topic came up, one of the things that came to light that I had not dived into in the past was the fact that race is not even, it's not really real. It's a made up social construct. And so I wanted to go back and do a little bit of research and dive into that. So if it's okay, I'll share a few of the things that I kind of found from that. And so the interesting thing is, race prior to the 18th century really just meant like type, kind, sort, but we used it in that context. It was not associated with skin color in any way whatsoever. And I'm going to give a really abridged version here, but essentially the colonies were looking for really cheap labor. Up until 18th century time, indentured servitude was really common. And so what this meant is that someone who is wealthy, who may be in the New World, would pay for the transport of these people to come to the Americas, and then to pay off that debt, they would work for free for a certain number of years for these individuals. And they might be white, they might be black. I mean, it was all varied, and at the end of that time frame, they were freed. And what was happening is that they were getting this very large group of poor, right, who did not have access because they had just been freed. There were concerns about rebellion and riots because this group of poor people were demanding access to things. And at the same time, they were running out of this cheap labor pool. And so they decided, you know what, the best option is to pull people from Africa for a couple of reasons. Africans were not dying from disease like the Native Americans here in the US were. They were already comfortable with growing crops in the same kind of environment that existed in the South, and there was nowhere for them to run to. So if you were a Native American, you could run away, but if you were African, I mean, you were stuck here. You had no access to go back. And so we started bringing people from Africa, and this whole concept of race was really to help reinforce and to justify the fact that we were treating people as less than or not human. And it began really intensely around 1850s, of getting to the point where people were trying to define it as like a completely separate species. Like, oh, well, Black people are a completely separate species. They are inferior, and this inferiority is linked because of their skin color. And so it was being socially reinforced by people in power, politically reinforced, scientific, like very not accurate science being used to reinforce this idea, articles, books being published, all of that. And so this concept of race being linked to a skin color, and then also, wrongfully assigning all of these other attributes, which are really linked to learning and culture and upbringing and other environmental conditions being linked to your skin color. All of that really started from, that 17 to 1800s time frame, and was continually then reinforced.
Yeah, and it was also reinforced in law, right? We put it into laws to, even with slaves that had children, we said automatically if you're birthed to a mother who is a slave, you're automatically enslaved, which is totally different from indentured servitude, right? That became laws, and then even laws that said, what people were entitled to. It was free persons are entitled to this, and so it was further reinforced. Even by our laws.
Yes, thank you for that clarification. I meant legally when I was saying politically, but that is, yes, absolutely true. And it even started with, when we're talking about indentured servants, so there were African people who had been indentured servants who then were freed and had accumulated wealth and assets and things. And then as these laws were passing, they were being forced back down, right, in this like made up hierarchy based on skin color. And they were passing laws that would actually treat freed European indentured servants differently than African indentured servants. And so by doing this, they kind of quelled the masses a little bit of that poor European population, which was much larger than the African population at the time. So they were quelling this rebellion by allocating resources and things to this group and giving them, special treatment, and then also solving for this dilemma of free labor and how can we still be profitable. So really this concept of race generated from the the greed and hunger to maintain riches, resources, land, and wealth.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's also important and interesting to note that even back then, there were white people that disagreed as well. And so in order to combat that, what the group in power decided that they needed to do was make these, like you said, fake scientific studies. We had to kind of convince Americans that this is the right way. This is the right way the Lord intended, because these people are not really people. So don't worry, don't feel so bad. And in that way they made it sustainable, right? And stopped some dissidents early on.
So there's a lot of history. I did a lot of research, so we'll include some resources and some links in the description box below. So feel free to click on those and look. A lot of really great detail and being able to follow the timeline of what was happening and some of this research that was done, and then the conclusions really being manipulated in a way that was not accurate to support this idea that the African race was inferior to Europeans, white Europeans.
And I think important to call out too is doing this research and checking out these resources that we'll provide to you. It's not going to be something you learned in school. It's going to be totally different. And if you're anything like us, you'll be thinking, where was this part of the story as I was learning American history? It's totally get ready for a mind blown moment.
Yeah, I mean, and in a prior episode, I mentioned how my school did a decent job of walking us through the realities of what happens during, the Revolutionary War period, Civil War, etc. And so things like Manifest Destiny, I was familiar with, but the studies on like craniotomy, like that whole research study, I never learned about that.
Okay, so we know that it's made up. It's not a real thing. It was done basically for economic reasons, capitalism, right? And I mean, honestly, it was pretty strategic, right? Pretty smart way of affecting and influencing not only the people's mindsets, but like a culture in a way that's sustainable over centuries of time. So let's fast forward, past slavery time, and let's go into like the 50s and 60s, civil rights era, and how the view on race kind of evolved. And you know what I love about Robin DiAngelo's book? This reminds me of that. She presented the idea that racism is not just like one specific thing. racism evolves over time, and it's dynamic, and it changes. What it looks like, what it feels like, what it sounds like changes over time. So as we go through the timeline of the history, it's just really mind-blowing to me how how we change. So anyway, so we're in the 50s and 60s, the civil rights era, and of course we have Martin Luther King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech, and he has that other famous line, I have a dream that I hope that one day, and I'm paraphrasing, my children will be judged on the content of their character and not the color of their skin. And so, people are thinking we're in a post-racial society, right? Slavery is over. Everything's good. We think we're getting along. You'll see quotes on interviews and documentaries now of people saying, yeah, we're getting along well. White people saying, things are good. Things are good now. And people are wanting to really latch on to something that separates themselves from racism, from racist people, from racist acts and beliefs that we're seeing on TV now, because TV is a thing and it's being publicized. And so I think a lot of people latched on to that line in MLK's speech as, oh, okay, content of character, yes, that's what's important. So let's not worry about race. Let's not talk about it. Let's not see it. Let's just judge people on who they are. Let's see the person first and not necessarily their race. But, and Robin DiAngelo alludes to this too, I think that was misguided for a couple of reasons. I think people latched onto that because they wanted to move on. They wanted to separate themselves from the violent acts that they were seeing on TV and hearing about in the news. And I also think it made people it kind of helped us soothe ourselves, and we'll see that over history too, and what Americans do to make ourselves feel better about our tainted, toxic, terrifying past, making ourselves feel better about how we act now.
Like that explanation is definitely something that I can relate to, of saying that I only judge somebody by the content of their character versus seeing race, that puts you on the better side, right? Like I'm not one of those racist people. And which, if you've not watched our episodes on the definition of racism, this would be an opportunity just to say to go back and watch that, because the way that we're talking about racist here is using kind of the generally accepted definition versus more of that like systemic kind of ideal. So, this idea of colorblindness and choosing a side, and, racism is inherently bad. And so in order for me to be good, I have to not acknowledge that it's happening, is kind of thinking that I had months ago, versus as we're going through this journey and how my understanding of it is evolving.
And can we pause? You mentioned the generally accepted definition of racism. Can we just be clear? I think generally accepted, when we say generally, we mean me and you. That doesn't mean it's the generally accepted definition. So I just want to be clear that we're not saying that, because it's not, right? I mean, we clearly don't know. There's a whole mass of people that don't feel the way we feel. So who are we to say what's the generally accepted?
Yeah, I could clarify that by saying the current dictionary definition. If you went to the dictionary today, current dictionary definition of racism being a belief or an act, it is a moment, right? It's a thought I'm having, it's something that I'm acting out, versus the definition of it being an ongoing system that we're all participating in. It does not have to be a specific instance.
Okay.
Or an aggression, right, against another person based on their skin color. Yep. The interesting thing too with all of that is that there's a large group, right, who say, well, colorblindness is not helpful, and here are reasons why, and we're going to dive into those in just a few moments. And here's why we need to stop colorblindness, because it's not helpful. And that is not a universally accepted belief, though. There are also people who say, by encouraging the white community to not be colorblind, or encouraging the white community to embrace their race and to embrace whiteness, that could it could backfire, I guess, in a way, where now you have the white community, instead of acknowledging, yes, that racism happens, it's more like white pride, I guess, is some of the philosophy there.
When I think about the debate and how, there's really some of the articles that we're reading, they share pros and cons for being colorblind and for not being colorblind. And something in my research that I pulled up that I thought was super interesting is the issue of colorblind casting in entertainment, in film, and specifically in Broadway musicals, because Hamilton came up in some of my research on colorblindness. And I just thought this was really interesting that, when I saw Hamilton, and I'm sure when a lot of our viewers saw it as well, of course, we noticed right off the bat, there's Black and brown people portraying these characters that are not Black and brown. So that's like a wow and a whoa. And everything that I've heard and thought has been celebrating this. Like, this is great. Look what joy we can bring and put on the stage. And look what we'd be missing out on if we just took white stories and kept them for white characters only. So I always thought that the casting was something to be celebrated. And just to clarify, so everybody understands, colorblind casting, it means that you have roles that might be created for a certain color or race of person, but just because that role was written for that type of person, that doesn't mean that you're going to cast it exactly the same. And I just want to clarify, because as I've been talking about this, I know some people, when they hear colorblind casting, they might think, oh, does it mean the casting director is behind a curtain or with a blindfold and just listening to the audition? That's not it. It's actually knowing that the roles and the stories, in this case, Hamilton, a historical, like true to life story, did not include certain races, and we're not going to let that stop us from casting it as such. So again, I thought it was great. Everything I had heard was that it was celebrated, but as I'm researching colorblindness and the debate between, like, what are the pros and cons, I even saw that there are generally accepted cons to colorblind casting. And one, just for example, one was that it, in Hamilton specifically, it allows people of color, Black and brown people, to own these stories and connect with these stories in ways that they maybe hadn't before. And why that's a bad thing is, this is not our story. We were not part of this story. Like, the part that we played is the part that we're not talking about, that we're not highlighting, that we're not telling our stories. We're telling still the whitewash history. We're telling the white stories, and we're thinking like, oh, okay, this is progress. This is great. This is fine. The job is done. Check the box, because Black people are playing the roles. But really, the job is not done, because we're still missing out on telling our stories. And so I just thought that was so mind-blowing, that something that I took for granted as being so amazing, and I still think it is so amazing. I still think the casting and how that Lin-Manuel Miranda did that was a beautiful thing. But just having our minds open to the fact that there is work to be done, and when we're given something, yes, accept it, celebrate it, love it, but think a little bit more critically about what it's solving for and what we still need to solve for. So that's something that came up that I was not anticipating when I was researching, the pros and cons of colorblindness.
I mean, my thought on that is it can be both, right? It brings up a little bit of that either or thinking. Can it be that the casting for Hamilton was an amazing opportunity that showcased the talents of all of these people of color, and at the same time, we need to not forget that this is still telling the story of white history, and there is still opportunity there to dive into more of, I almost hesitate to even just say Black history. It's American history, in my opinion. It's our history, but the more about the Black experience within that history. So I kind of want to have both. I want like the opportunities and to be able to celebrate that and not dismiss some of those other ideals too.
I like that. The power of and. Yeah, it needs to be both. And that kind of will help some people, because I know there's some critics who are like, man, can't we have anything? Can't we just be happy? Like, can't we just do something and celebrate it? Do we always have to look for what's wrong with something or what we can do better? But the way you put it, I think, is the right balance to say, yes, like, this is great. We love this. And we know that there's still work to be done. So what are we solving for? So, and I think, clearly I shared a lot of passion just now about Hamilton. So I know we're going to talk about our personal experiences with color blindness. I also, I have to bring up uh, Cinderella. The Cinderella, I think it was, I got to look up the date. I'm thinking 97, but I'm not sure. Let me check that. Where Brandy was played Cinderella, and Whitney Houston played the fairy godmother. Whoopi Goldberg was the queen. It was just it's a whole, I know I just mentioned only Black characters just now, but forgive me. The prince was of Filipino descent. I don't remember his name, but he was delicious. So it was a completely colorblind cast as well. And I remember being so excited about that and feeling like that was such a big milestone. And it did well, right? It did well. The music was, Bernadette Peters was the wicked stepmother. The music did so well. And I just remember that being huge. But then, as I'm talking to my fiance about this whole thing, as this conversation is coming up, I bring up, and of course he knows Hamilton, but I bring up Cinderella, and I'm shocked to hear that he had never seen or heard of that Cinderella. So again, just another like aha moment. I think I even take some of these things for granted, and I'm finding out that in my life, because did I ask you, you hadn't seen it, but you had heard of it, the Brandy Cinderella?
Yeah, I feel like I have a vague memory of somebody bringing it up. I definitely did not know that it existed when it came out by any means. But I feel like at some point over the last 3 to 5 years, maybe someone had, or actually, it may have been, some of the more recent ones like Aladdin, and Will Smith's casting as the genie, and Ariel. It may have been in conversations with that somebody had brought up, or I read about this version of Cinderella, but I haven't seen it. And I definitely, like I said, I definitely did not know that it had come out in the 90s when I was living in the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.